Imagine being locked in Alcatraz, the most inescapable prison on Earth, after a betrayal by a legendary mob boss. Now imagine you're Bumpy Johnson, and you're not just surviving, you're planning the impossible. We're diving deep into the audacious, meticulously crafted prison break plot that wasn't just a desperate bid for freedom, but a move that cemented his legendary status. The year was 1951. Bumpy Johnson had built an empire in Harlem. He controlled the numbers, rackets commanded respect, from street corners to penthouse suites, and had forged alliances with some of the most powerful figures in organized crime. His name carried weight, his word was law, and his protection extended across neighborhoods where most gangsters feared to tread. But power in the underworld is a fragile thing. It doesn't matter how much respect you command, if the people you trust decide you're more valuable as a sacrifice than as a partner. Lucky Luciano was one of those people. The man who reorganized the Italian mafia. The man who turned chaos into structure. The man who believed that alliances were tools, not bonds. And when federal pressure intensified, when law enforcement needed scalps to hang on the wall, Luciano made a calculated decision. Bumpy Johnson would be the sacrifice. It wasn't personal, it was business. Luciano fed information to the feds, orchestrated a setup, and watched as Bumpy was arrested, tried, and sentenced, not to just any prison, not to a place where connections and influence could reach, but to Alcatraz, the Rock, the island fortress in San Francisco Bay that the government specifically designed to hold men who were too dangerous, too connected, or too smart for any other facility. Bumpy Johnson arrived at Alcatraz with his reputation intact but his power stripped away. The guards knew who he was. The inmates knew who he was. But on the Rock, none of that mattered. Because Alcatraz didn't care about your past. It only cared about one thing, keeping you inside. And it was very, very good at that. Alcatraz sat on an island in the middle of San Francisco Bay, surrounded by water so cold it could kill a man in minutes. The currents were treacherous, unpredictable, pulling in multiple directions at once. Even strong swimmers who somehow made it past the prison walls and into the water faced odds that were almost mathematically impossible. The distance to shore wasn't far, just over a mile, but the temperature, the currents, and the exhaustion from any escape attempt meant that reaching land alive was a fantasy. Inside the prison, security was suffocating. Guard towers watched every angle. Head counts happened constantly. Cells were inspected daily. Every movement was monitored. Every sound was noted. The prison was designed with one philosophy. You will not leave here unless we decide to release you. Most inmates accepted this. They settled into routines, served their time, and tried to keep their sanity intact. But Bumpy Johnson was not most inmates. He walked into Alcatraz knowing that Lucky Luciano had betrayed him, knowing that the streets of Harlem were continuing without him, knowing that every day he spent behind bars was a day his enemies could consolidate power, erase his influence, and turn his name into a memory. And Bumpy couldn't accept that. The first few weeks were the hardest, not because of the guards or the routine, but because of the silence, the isolation, the realization that everything he had built was slipping through his fingers while he was trapped in a concrete cell with nothing but time. He watched other inmates. He studied the guards. He memorized schedules. He noticed patterns. And slowly, an idea began to form. Not a desperate fantasy, not a reckless impulse, but a calculated, methodical plan. If Alcatraz was inescapable, then he would have to do what no one else had done. He would have to think beyond the walls, beyond the water, beyond the rules everyone else accepted. He would have to escape. The idea was audacious, insane, even, but Bumpy had spent his entire life doing things people said were impossible. He had built an empire in a city that didn't want black men to have power. He had negotiated with the Italian mafia as an equal when most black gangsters were treated as subordinates. He had survived betrayals, assassinations, and wars. And now, he would survive Alcatraz, but he couldn't do it alone. Bumpy began to watch. Not just the guards, but the other inmates. He needed people who were smart, patient, and desperate enough to risk everything. He needed people who understood that this wasn't a fantasy. It was a gamble with death as the cost of failure. He found his first recruit in a man named Samuel Big Sam Carter. Big Sam was serving 20 years for armed robbery. He was strong, disciplined, and most importantly, he had skills. Before his arrest, Sam had worked construction. He understood structural integrity. He understood how buildings were put together. And that meant he understood how they could be taken apart. Bumpy approached him carefully, not with grand speeches or promises. Just a simple question, during yard time, spoken quietly enough that no one else could hear. "You ever think about leaving this place?" Sam looked at him like he was crazy. "Everyone thinks about it. Nobody does it." Bumpy nodded. "That's because everyone thinks it's impossible." Sam stared at him for a long moment. Then he asked the only question that mattered. "You got a plan?" Bumpy didn't answer right away. He just smiled. The kind of smile that said, "Not yet, but I will." Over the next few weeks, Bumpy recruited 2 more men. One was a forger named Marcus Fingers Williams, who had been arrested for creating fake documents so convincing that even federal agents had trouble spotting them. The other was a former dock worker named Raymond Ray Thompson, who knew the waters of San Francisco Bay better than anyone. Ray had grown up on those docks. He had swum in those currents. And while he respected their danger, he didn't fear them the way most people did. These 3 men became Bumpy's inner circle, his crew, his conspirators, and together, they began to plan the impossible. The plan was simple in concept, but terrifyingly complex in execution. They would tunnel out, not through the walls, those were too thick, too monitored. Not through the floors, those were solid concrete, but through the ventilation shafts and maintenance tunnels that ran beneath and behind the cells. Alcatraz was old. It had been built in the 1930s, and while the security was legendary, the infrastructure was aging. There were gaps, weaknesses, places where the original builders had prioritized function over absolute security. Bumpy and his crew studied the layout obsessively. They memorized blueprints they sketched from memory, based on overheard conversations between maintenance workers. They timed guard patrols down to the second. They identified blind spots in the surveillance. And slowly, they began to gather tools. This was the hardest part. Because in Alcatraz, everything was controlled. Inmates weren't allowed to have anything that could be used as a weapon or a tool. Every spoon, every fork, every piece of metal was accounted for. If something went missing, the entire prison went into lockdown. So Bumpy and his crew had to be creative. They stole spoons during meals and hid them in the seams of their clothing. They pried loose screws from bed frames and tables, working them free over weeks of patient effort. They repurposed pieces of metal from the prison workshop, where inmates were occasionally allowed to do labor under heavy supervision. And they smuggled these items back to their cells, piece by piece, hiding them in places the guards wouldn't think to look. Marcus used his forger skills to create false bottoms in their food trays. Big Sam fashioned makeshift chisels from bed springs. Ray found a way to hollow out the heel of his shoe to hide small tools, and Bumpy coordinated everything, making sure that no single person carried too much risk at once. It took months just to gather the materials. And then the real work began. The tunnel started in a maintenance shaft behind Bumpy's cell. The shaft was narrow, dark, and filled with old pipes that hadn't been inspected in years. It was also the perfect starting point because it led toward the outer wall of the prison and, eventually, toward the water. Digging was painstaking. The walls were concrete reinforced with steel. Every strike of the chisel had to be quiet. Every chunk of rock had to be removed without making noise. And every session had to be timed perfectly to coincide with moments when the guards were distracted, during head counts, during shift changes, during meals. Big Sam did most of the physical work. His construction background meant he understood where to strike, how to weaken the concrete without causing a collapse, and how to reinforce the tunnel as they went. But the work was exhausting. His hands bled, his muscles ached, and the constant fear of discovery hung over every second. Bumpy took shifts to 2, not because he was stronger, but because he refused to ask his men to do something he wouldn't do himself. And during those shifts, he thought about Harlem. He thought about the streets he used to walk. He thought about the people who were waiting for him. and he thought about Lucky Luciano, the man who had put him here. That thought kept him digging, but digging was only half the problem. They also had to hide the evidence. Every night, they removed chunks of concrete and rock from the tunnel. And every night, they had to get rid of it without anyone noticing. They couldn't just leave it in their cells. They couldn't dump it in the yard. And they couldn't flush it down the toilets. So they came up with a system. Marcus fashioned small pouches from torn fabric and thread he smuggled from the prison laundry. They filled these pouches with rock dust and small debris, then sewed them into the linings of their clothes. During yard time, they would walk around casually, letting the dust and debris fall out in small amounts, scattering it across the ground where it blended with the dirt and gravel. For larger pieces, they used a different method. Ray had access to the prison workshop, where inmates built furniture and performed repairs. He smuggled pieces of rock into the workshop and mixed them with wood shavings and metal scraps that were already being disposed of. The guards never noticed. Why would they? It was just trash. Bumpy Johnson and his 2 companions in prison worked hard to escape for many months. The system worked. Slowly, carefully, over months of effort, the tunnel grew. But secrecy was fragile, and in a place like Alcatraz, one mistake could unravel everything. Bumpy knew they needed a communication system, something that would allow them to coordinate without speaking openly. Because even in the yard, even in moments that seemed private, there were always ears listening. They developed a code, simple gestures that looked innocent. A hand on the shoulder meant tonight, a scratch of the nose meant wait, a nod meant all clear. And for more complex messages, they used a system of taps on the cell walls at night. 1 tap for yes, 2 for no, 3 for danger, and longer sequences for specific instructions. It was crude, but it worked. And it kept them invisible. For 6 months, the plan moved forward without a hitch. The tunnel was nearly complete. They had calculated the distance to the outer wall. They had identified the weakest point where they could break through. And they had even begun to plan the water crossing, using makeshift flotation devices built from stolen raincoats and inflated with air from the prison workshop. Everything was falling into place. And then, it all fell apart. It started with something small. A guard noticed that one of the inmates not part of Bumpy's crew, just someone who happened to be in the wrong place, was acting nervous during a routine cell inspection. The guard didn't think much of it at first. Inmates were always nervous. But something about the way the man's eyes kept darting toward the ventilation shaft made the guard pause. He called for backup, and they searched the cell more thoroughly than usual. They found nothing in that cell. But the search triggered a chain reaction. Other guards became more vigilant. Inspections became more frequent. And one night, during a surprise sweep of the maintenance areas, a guard noticed something unusual. Fresh scratches on the wall of a ventilation shaft. Small, but visible. The kind of marks that come from repeated impact. The warden ordered an immediate investigation. Within hours, they found the tunnel. It was almost complete. Just a few more feet and it would have broken through to the outside. But now, it was discovered. And the warden wanted to know who was responsible. Bumpy and his crew knew it was over the moment they heard the alarms. The prison went into lockdown. Guards flooded the cell blocks. Inmates were questioned one by one, and the evidence trail, no matter how carefully they had hidden it, eventually led back to them. Bumpy didn't resist when they came for him. There was no point. He had known from the beginning that this was a gamble. And he had lost. He was taken to solitary confinement. A small, dark cell, with no windows, no contact, no light, just silence. And for the first time in months, Bumpy had nothing to do but sit with his thoughts. Most men would have been broken by this. The failure, the isolation, the realization that they had come so close and lost everything. But Bumpy Johnson wasn't most men. Because even in failure, he had done something no one else had dared to attempt. He had looked at Alcatraz, the most secure prison in the world, and said, "I can break out." And he had almost succeeded. The news of Bumpy's escape attempt spread through the prison like wildfire. Inmates whispered about it in the yard. Guards talked about it in the break room. And even the warden, in his official report, noted that the plan had been extraordinarily sophisticated. Bumpy spent 6 months in solitary. 6 months of silence, darkness, and isolation. But when he was finally released back into the general population, something had changed. He was no longer just a powerful gangster who had been betrayed and imprisoned. He was the man who had almost escaped Alcatraz. The man who had dug a tunnel under the most secure prison on earth. The man who refused to accept that anything was impossible. His legend grew. Other inmates looked at him differently, not with fear, but with respect, because Bumpy had proven something that no one else could, that even in a place designed to break you, the human spirit could still fight back. The prison authorities responded by increasing security. They sealed the ventilation shafts. They reinforced the maintenance tunnels. They added more frequent inspections and more random searches. Bumpy's failed escape attempt led directly to changes that made Alcatraz even harder to escape from. But that didn't matter to Bumpy, because he had already won the only victory that mattered. He had proven that he was unbreakable, and eventually, after years of confinement, Bumpy Johnson was released, not because of the escape attempt, but because his sentence was served. And when he walked out of Alcatraz, he returned to Harlem, not as a man who had been defeated, but as a man who had survived the impossible. The escape attempt became part of his legend. People told stories about it in bars and barbershops. They exaggerated the details, turned it into myth. But at the core of every story was a truth that everyone understood. Bumpy Johnson was a man who refused to be contained. And that refusal, that unbreakable spirit, was what made him a legend that endures to this day. In the years after his release, Bumpy continued to shape Harlem. He protected his community. He fought off rival gangs. He negotiated with the mafia. And he never forgot the lesson he learned in Alcatraz. That the greatest power isn't physical strength or violence. It's the refusal to accept defeat. That's why, decades later, when people talk about Bumpy Johnson, they don't just talk about his empire or his influence. They talk about the man who dug a tunnel under Alcatraz, the man who almost escaped the inescapable, the man who turned failure into legend. Because in the end, the escape attempt wasn't about freedom, it was about defiance. It was about refusing to let betrayal, imprisonment, or impossible odds define who he was. And that defiance is what made Bumpy Johnson immortal. His story is a reminder that sometimes the greatest victories aren't the ones where you win. They're the ones where you refuse to quit, where you look at a situation that seems hopeless and say, I will find a way. Bumpy Johnson found a way. And even though the tunnel was discovered, even though the plan failed, even though he spent 6 months in solitary confinement, he proved something that no one could take away from him. He proved that he was unbreakable. And that's why his legend endures. This is a story of Bumpy Johnson's most audacious prison break plot. A story of betrayal, ingenuity, and the unbreakable human spirit. A story that reminds us that even in the darkest places, even when the odds are impossible, the refusal to give up is the most powerful weapon of all. Subscribe if you want more untold stories of legendary figures who refused to be broken, because the real history isn't just about who won. It's about who had the courage to try.